Recording. All right, here we go. Hello and welcome to Reader 2 Standing By, Episode 10. I'm Wedge.
And I'm Wraith14.
And we are so happy to have you join us in our journey through the X-Wing series of Star Wars stories from the old expanded universe. This episode, we're talking about the 8th book in the X-Wing series, Michael A. Stackpole's 5th and final official entry. Don't worry, we're doing 3 more of his books, plus a comic, Isard's Revenge. Spoiler alert. We will spoil everything we've covered so far in the podcast and the entire book we're reading today. Before we get into the book discussion proper, let's get a little context. First, Out of Universe. This book was published April 13th, 1999. It was published 2 months after Solo Command, the final book in the Wraith trilogy by Aaron Alston, in February 1999. And it was published 4 months before the next, and for over a decade, the final X-Wing novel of Starfighters of Adamar in August of 1999. So they published 3 X-Wing books in 1999. Reminds me of the glorious days of when Stackpole published 3 X-Wing books in 1996. Stackpole's previous Star Wars book, because obviously he wasn't writing the Wraith Squadron trilogy, was I, Jedi in May 1998, which was 11 months before Isard's Revenge was released. And his next Star Wars book was Star Wars The New Jedi Order Dark Tide 1 Onslaught, which came out in February of 2000, which was 10 months after Isard's Revenge. So he had a little under a year in both directions for Star Wars projects. But of course, I think he was probably writing other non-Star Wars books, and of course he was very heavily involved in the Star Wars story conferences with James Luceno and the rest of the Star Wars authors for the New Jedi Order. So he was a busy bee, not just releasing 1 book a year. The biggest Star Wars thing that happened close to April 1999, of course, was The Phantom Menace coming out in May 1999. Now, because it's 30 years before the original trilogy, it doesn't impact the X-Wing books that much. But, of course, any Star Wars fan, it is good to kind of think about. That's when you start getting prequel references and connections to older things that happened in the Old Republic, as well as just stuff happening since the Battle of Yavin. The Bantam contract was ending. Most people think of Vision of the Future as the last Bantam book, but there was actually an entire year and 6 to 10 extra novels and young adult novels and stuff that were still published by Bantam. But of course, they happened before Vision of the Future in the timeline. So people kind of mash those around since they're only a year apart. But for those people who were reading the books as they came out, which I was in 1998, 1999, I remember reading Vision of the Future and then reading the X-Wing books and being like, oh, so that's how these things fit together. In universe, the Thrawn trilogy overlaps the first chapter of this book, because, of course, Thrawn is defeated at the Battle of Bilbringi, and the first chapter of this is the Battle of Bilbringi. A year later, according to the Dark Empire West End Games RPG sourcebook, the Emperor Reborn attacks Coruscant and takes it back from the New Republic. And Isard's Revenge, this campaign against Prince Admiral Dilak Krenel, takes place entirely within that year. It's actually, I think, much shorter, at most 6 months, but I think even that's pushing it. I want to say it's between 2 and 3 months. But and Wraith likes to Ray's favorite Star Wars short story, perhaps I'm exaggerating, but it is one of his favorites, is a transitional piece between the Thrawn trilogy era to Dark Empire, and maybe you can tell us about that.
Sorry, it slipped my mind that we were going to that right now. So this is in Dark Empire. Coruscant has fallen already, but in this story, Retreat from Coruscant, we get the closest idea of how that happened with a Imperial surprise attack. Think kind of like Pearl Harbor, except it's from the point of view of a mail courier who gets stuck on the ground, and she then her ship is conscripted into delivering a message for the New Republic, and she refuses to just give over her ship, so she gets stuck going along with that as well. And it's a very good kind of coming to terms with family stuff story that I like.
It's a solid story. It's very much in the vein of X-Wing stories, which is probably why Wraith enjoys it so much, because it's titanic events happening around people who are much more normal scale. You're not a Jedi or a Han Solo who is at the pivot point or the fulcrum of big events happening. You just happen to be caught up in something enormous, and you got to do your part to try and make things as better as they can be, even in terrible circumstances.
And there's some fun cameos kind of bridging Thrawn trilogy and Dark Empire that I don't want to spoil, but they're there.
Fans
and we
of
have
what
X-Wings and Starfighters in the background.
Fans of what I like to call the Zahn Alston Stackpole universe will definitely enjoy the cameos in Retreat from Coruscant. Right after Dark Empire comes the Crimson Empire series, and I only mention this because it was written a year before this Isard's Revenge came out, and it shows the Lusankya, which is a key plot point of Isard's Revenge, being commanded by Wedge and being the carrier vessel for Rogue Squadron. So I'm not sure how much of that was the creators of Crimson Empire and how much they were working with Mike Stackpole, but Stackpole was definitely working with the comics to try and put pieces in place for future stories.
Crimson Empire is not just Rogue Squadron that it's carrying, it's the entire Rogue Wing, which I don't have the greatest opinion of that.
But it is I was about to say, big thumbs down to the Rogue Wing thing.
As a possibility in Isard's Revenge, and they downplayed at the time, but it is something that comes up as this may happen later.
And it did happen briefly, but thankfully not for very long.
No, not a fan. So for the mission report of summarizing Isard's Revenge, it opens with the Rogue Squadron version of the Battle of Belbringi from The Last Command, from Corran's point of view, where they think they're going to be attacking Belbringi and the Empire will have fallen for their deception. The real attack is at Tangreen. But of course, this is Thrawn. He knows, and Corran is thinking, man, I'd like to meet him, shake his hand, and then kill him. Blissfully unaware that in one of the Stackpole and Zahn collaborative short stories, Corran has in fact already met Thrawn. And I don't remember the timing, if that had been written before or if it came after, but I'm pretty sure it was a reference to that, either as published or an idea. So it's a fun expansion of the rather brief battle scenes from Zahn's book. But I don't think Corran knows that they're escorting what will become the Smugglers Alliance into the Belbringi shipyards, because I was checking that part. But it has the same details of like which New Republic ships attack a Golan defense station, those sort of things. So it really throws the reader right into the action, which was funny in a group read I did of the X-Wing books. There was somebody who hadn't read the Thrawn trilogy, and was confused at the start. Just on the basis of, am I missing something? What's this battle? It seems like
they're
something
missing
that happened
3
in
books.
another books.
So after the Battle of Bilbringi ends in a surprise but happy Republic victory, in a bit of blatant retconning from the West End Games RPG Guide short stories, Admiral Akbar finally convinces Wedge to take the promotion to general by pressuring him to let his subordinates get bumped up in rank too. There's a bunch of connective tissue from the Wraith books to here in Akbar and Wedge's relationship. And all in all, it's a fun little scene for those people who knew that Wedge was going to become a general and wanted to see how they're finally going to let him do that. And I think that Stackpole does a good job of showing the character journey there.
Yeah. So then Corrin and Myrix unite on Coruscant in the hangar. Wedge talks to them, and then we have some alone time between Corrin and Myrix. And then they have a party that night to celebrate the victory over Thrawn. But at the party, Erlor Set, another prisoner from Lusancia with Corrin, and also General Dudana from A New Hope, shows up mysteriously. And then after Corrin says his name, because Erlor can't remember who he is, dies horrifically. And they lead that to believe either Isard's alive and out to get the rogues, or someone connected to her is. I don't think they jump to Isard's alive right away, but I could be wrong.
They definitely start that train of thought.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's something that comes later. But Gavin and Nasir are planning to marry and have a family after the rogues go after Isard and adopt children, since they can't have their own. However, Borsk Phalia, everyone's perhaps least favorite Bothan, tells
He's
us
not
here.
your least favorite Bothan. I don't know what your problem is.
Yeah, so he's pulling strings to try and force Asir to either marry a Bothan, particularly one connected to him, or he'll ruin her life and keep her from being able to adopt any kids, Bothan or otherwise, because Asir had been wanting to adopt at least one Bothan of her own. Meanwhile, on the outright villain side, we see the Prince Admiral Delek Krenel, self-styled title there, who was the bad guy from the last 2 arcs of the X-Wing comics, discovering Hussein Isard in his palace on the world of Cedric, where she proposes an alliance to defeat the New Republic's plans, and Rogue Squadron in particular, to eventually wipe them both out.
Aiello Siri, New Republic intelligence officer and love interest to Wedge Antilles, traces clues to Commodore, where the Wraiths were originally trained on the moon of Folor, and the Rogues, Lieutenant Page's Katarn commandos from the Thrawn trilogy and Cap Dendo's commandos from the X-Wing comics, take the prisoner facility hard and fast. They find a handful of prisoners alive who confirm Isard's return, and we see Isard and Krenel plotting together to deal with the oncoming New Republic attack.
Yes. So the New Republic has talked about how their reason for attacking Krenel, and this was a whole kind of command level discussion, is about his murder in the final X-Wing Rogue Squadron comic series of Sate Pestage, who had agreed to work with the New Republic, but then got exposed and had to go on the run. And they tried to get him out, failed because Pestage thought he could cut a deal with Krenel and instead got strangled. So now that they're going after Krenel for that, the first battle is on the world of Lineade 3, where you have one of Krenel's Impstar Deuces and a Dreadnought getting taken down by 2 New Republic Imperial Star Destroyers, including the Freedom, captained by Sarionka from the Back to War, and a Victory class captained by Admiral Areta Bell, which is something I'm sure we'll both be talking about later. The rogues take down the TIE fighters, then provide cover for the landing ground troops, fighting 4 AT-ATs in a short but pretty ferocious battle seen on the cover, without using their torpedoes in case they need them later. Over a ground facility, Corrin's X-Wing gets hit by a ground-to-air rocket launcher, like the ones you use in Battlefront 2 of 2005, not the newer one. That's nicknamed the Chip, and he has to land it on the ground. Then fighting from there in the facility learns that Krennic is building a super laser weapon.
In response to this horrifying discovery, the New Republic publicizes the weapon's development, leading to a propaganda campaign between the Republic and Krennic and Isard. The rogues debate the issue, and then are sent on a recon mission to the Corvus Minor System's moon of Distna, joined by Nrin Vakil, a Quarren pilot from the X-Wing comics. Nrin is flying the Recon X-Wing, which is introduced in the Black Fleet Crisis and also seen in the X-Wing comics. The rogues are jumped by 6 squadrons of TIEs. They vape about half of them, about 36 TIEs, but lose 4 pilots: Assur Salar, Gavin's Bothan partner, Wes Jansen, the Quarren Lear
Zatok, that we don't really know anything about her.
She has 0
how
lines.
her name is pronounced, and there's not been an audiobook, so. But it's not.
Well, there is an audiobook, but it's
not an unabridged one. I mean,
no, it's unabridged, but it's for the blind.
Yeah. Oh.
No special effects, no music, no voices. And the lizard pilot Kijin Slee, before 2 squadrons of TIE defenders, never seen by Corrin before, arrive and vape the remaining TIEs.
Yeah, we do get an interesting detail that Wedge is aware of the TIE defender as a concept, but didn't know the Empire had ever manufactured as many as he's just seen, which may or may not be an issue with Shadows of Mindor, another book.
Shadows of Mindor doesn't count, so I don't care.
Yeah. But these mystery TIE defenders help the rogues to a secret base where, after Wedge is reminded, hey, our boss is the one who saved your lives, they find out that said rescuer is none other than Isard herself, who tells them that the Isard working with Krennic is a clone. Who thinks she's the real Isard, and she proposes a deal with the devil to Wedge. Team up to defeat Krennic and the Isard clone, and the New Republic will let Isard herself fade into retirement. So Wedge and the rogues reluctantly agree because they're on her base and don't really have any other options.
Isard takes the rogues' astromech hostage to ensure the pilot's good behavior, but Whistler, Corrin's astromech, has a lot of police security droid modifications, which allow him to pull off the great droid escape, along with Wedge's astromech Gate, R5G8, or Gate. They meet up with Talon Karrde and his Lieutenant Aves, from the Thrawn trilogy, who then take them to Booster Terek, who has been recruited by General Kraken to work with Mirix and Ayala to plot against the returned Isard.
And if you remember at the end of Back to War, you know it would take a whole lot for Kraken to willingly not just work with Booster and his associates, but give the others, not Booster himself, 5 million credits apiece and carte blanche to break laws, and if they have to kill anybody, don't get caught, to figure out what Isard's up to.
Now, to be fair, Ayala is technically the supervisor of the operation, and Kraken likes Mirix. He just doesn't like Booster.
We've also found that Mirix has been giving Kraken information on what their dad's up to, because they're not wild about independent Star Destroyer running around. and that
A
the
bit
profit
of
margins,
foreshadowing for
yeah,
iJedi.
the profit margins for an independent Star Destroyer are very slim. So not a lot is fully operational on Booster's ship. But meanwhile, with the Rogues are undercover on Sutric with Wedge reinstating his Colonel Roat identity from Wedge's gamble when they took Coruscant for the New Republic. And they've explained the presence of the two remaining aliens in the Rogues. Oral is just described as another Gand and how he's like Zuckuss, who served Darth Vader. And then Narin tells Krenel he's there because where else can he kill Mon Calamari, which is the usual attitude of a lot of Quarrens, but certainly not Narin's himself. I've been wondering after Elasar Targan found out the hard way he couldn't be a convincing Imperial, how they were going to explain that part with those two in the TIE Defender crew, but Colonel goes for it since he's had this sort of policy of we'll take in anyone who doesn't like what the New Republic's doing, and we don't want war. They're just attacking us as part of the political stuff. So the Rogues are scouting out the base and the personnel, and when the New Republic attacks, they destroy Colonel's pilots and ground operations. There's a really great scene where a self-styled X-181st guy, who I think he says, who was only a lieutenant in the 181st, but that was the equivalent of a major in any other unit, something like that. Very braggadocious. Has been talking about how the Rogue Squadron pilots are nowhere near as good as people think they are, but the New Republic has been cloning them, and so that's how they stick around. And he's certain, even though they've been reported dead, that Rogue Squadron will return as clones. So Wedge cons him when the alarms have gone off into going into a private office with the blinds closed, and starts taking off his disguise. And he's like, "You were right. I'm Wedge Antilles. I'm back." And stuns the guy. So once they're back up in the air, Wedge and his flight kill Isard's clone, who's trying to escape with a remote piloted shuttle like she did at Thyfera, and has that aforementioned X-181st guy doing the remote piloting. But he has a tendency to sideslip that Wedge recognizes. Quarren, Narin, so those names at the same time, and Oral rescue the prisoners, and Akbar and his fleet wipe out Krenel's fleet by using one of the tricks learned from Thrawn of waiting until he gets a interdictor cruiser powered up and then jumping in reinforcements.
The real Isard, however, had another plan to steal the repaired Lusankya from Bilbringi and return to power again using the Super Star Destroyer. However, Booster, Ayala, and Mirix stop her, Ayala cornering Isard in her old quarters and shooting her when Isard desperately tries to escape.
Yeah. During that, we also see a certain Blackford Bothan with Booster Terex Leia bridge crew, because the Isard, after being surprised by Ayala in her quarters, tries to bribe Booster and his three people, the crew on the bridge, 25 million credits apiece, or 75 million if you kill the others, to join her, and they flatly refuse. So the Rogues have returned to the New Republic victorious, and they throw another party, this time with no new deaths. And now the Rogues that were on Sutra get to find out Wes Jansen survived. Gavin is still very sad about losing a seer, but Ayala, in a conversation with Asir, kind of informs the reader that Asir is going to be going off to wage a undercover, taking a new identity, political war against Phalia and his ideas, on the basis that that's the only way she can reform Botham societies from the inside, and she can't do that with Gavin.
And that's the end of Isard's Revenge. Now, our after action report where we dive into the analysis. So, we've got 3 sections, and the first one is our continuity questions. Let's start with how does our Corran point of view Battle of Bilbringi fit with the Wedge and Thrawn point of view of the Battle of Bilbringi in The Last Command?
Pretty well. I mean, like I mentioned, Corran doesn't know everything Wedge knows, but the dialogue matches. For instance, in Last Command, there's a quote attributed to Rogue 2, and here we see that's Tycho speaking. And we see similar stuff like that in Hand of Thrawn duology, where Corran and Wedge are like the main. Yeah, it's Corran and Wedge are the main ones I think we see talking, and then there's like Rogue 7, etc. Because by that point, we don't know who all is in Rogue Squadron.
Yeah. The one thing that I think maybe is a slight, I hesitate to say negative. It's just not like the best. Is I feel like Bilbringi is the climactic battle. It's like the Battle of Endor, but it's basically like 2 or 3 pages in Last Command. And this one does expand it to about 8 or 9 pages, but it still feels really quick. Like they jump out of hyperspace, they get through the initial wave of ties, they take down the Golan, and then Thrawn is killed. Whereas I don't know, I feel like it might have been cool if they made it like an hour-long battle and they'd come in when Corran had been fighting for 40 minutes and then they take down the Golan.
Well, would Thrawn really give them that much time?
I mean, it is a completely legitimate interpretation of the Battle of Bilbringi, but I just kind of wish it was a little more epic since it is the climactic space battle. I mean, Zahn focuses on the force battle on Wayland in Last Command, but I love the Starfighter battles.
I mean, yeah, I do too. Not complaining. It's just as soon as they get the word that Wayland's under attack and that the Noghri are helping, that's when Rook is like, okay, time to go.
Time to go. Now.
And it makes sense he wouldn't let it stretch out too long either.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's not that important to the plot. I mean, it's important that it sets up Bilbringi is now under New Republic control. So there's that bookendy feeling with the final scene of Isard versus Ayala on the Lusankya at Bilbringi. Oh, that reminds me. One more question to add. So, Wraith, I don't think has read this, but there is a short story, I want to say in the Dark Empire source book, where Akbar convinces Wedge to become a general. And the second chapter of Isard's Revenge completely retcons it. It's just a totally different conversation and totally different motivation. I don't mind because that short story was kind of crappy, but it is
that the one about how they've had like so many like ground army losses? Or am I thinking of something else?
It's really short. It's like maybe a couple paragraphs at most.
What's the reason that Akbar uses to convince him?
I don't remember. Huh. It's not anywhere close to as good as this reason, which is why I don't mind the retcon. I think that tying it back to the whole Akbar and Wedge bet during the Wraith Squadron trilogy. And also, of course, Tim Zahn talks about how Wedge had turned down promotion several times. So that all together forms a nice arc for Wedge. And we know he has to become a general because in Dark Empire and the Jedi Academy trilogy, he is a general. So I think this is a nice way to move him there. But that does get us a couple questions about the whole rank thing. The first thing is, does Wedge actually need the rank of general in this mission against Krenel?
He's just commanding a squadron, so at that point he doesn't, but Akbar does have a point that, Wedge turning down promotions is holding the others back because you can't have them of equal rank or higher, really. Certainly not higher in a squadron.
Yeah, you couldn't have Tycho being a colonel with Wedge being functioning a colonel as a commander.
Yeah.
Actually, I think colonel's probably higher than commander. There's just not that many commanders, but they stuck Wedge with commander rank in one book, so they had to keep it. They just didn't give anyone else that rank.
I think when he's a colonel in
the
comics, but I still think he outranks Wedge there as well as when he's
but Wedge in the comics is a captain. He gets promoted to commander between the comics and the Rogue Squadron novel.
This is the problem when they were combining Army and Navy ranks. But in my mind, there's like captain, commander, colonel, general. And if you're Black Fleet Crisis, you can throw Commodore in there too. But that's not really a starfighter rank.
Commodore, isn't that Ethan Abbat? Isn't he?
Well, I know Wedge gets made a Commodore.
He does?
I'm pretty sure he's like they recommission him and make him a Commodore when they send him out. Black Fleet Crisis spoilers, and he gets captured. Punch
QB McDowell so hard. He's so frustrating. Okay, we'll talk about that later in a different episode. I like the scene. I think it's a good evolution of the character. It's not necessary for this book. And one of the problems with the kind of spoilers for our later discussion, one of the problems with this book is it's very much a filling in the blanks because it's written after most of the major character developments have been sketched out by books like Vision of the Future and Jedi Academy trilogy. And like all these things had already set where Wedge's character goes. So this is kind of just, this is how it gets there. And I think it works. And I appreciate that it does give more of an arc to Wedge's decision, but Wedge doesn't need to be a general in this book. He doesn't pull rank on anyone. He doesn't need to call on resources. He could have done everything he does in this book as a commander. That being said, it is really fun to see all the rogues get promotions. So let's go through the rogues that we know get promotions. Obviously, Tycho becomes a colonel because that's the rank you have to be commanding a squadron, at least. Sometimes you can command a wing of... Isn't a wing 3 squadrons?
Wing... So I can't remember. I think it had been 3 squadrons. There might be a point where this describes it as 6 squadrons.
Oh, man.
Because I think it says a full wing aboard one of the Star Destroyers, 6 squadrons. I'm like, but that's 2 wings.
Maybe you can justify that by being Imperial versus New Republics, but
yeah,
Star Wars authors just didn't give a crap too many times.
Let me see where the other promotions are.
Jansen and Hobby get the next highest bump. They go from lieutenants to majors. And we know they're majors because in Starfighter with Adumar, they're majors. I think that's the only other book that actually references their ranks, though. Most of the other rogues go from lieutenant to captain. So we know for sure that Corrin, Gavin, and Asur Salar, the Bothan, go to captain. My guess is that this may not be fair, but my guess is that Lur Zatok, the Quarren female, and Hijin Slee, the Isori male from Isor. They go to. I don't see them going much past lieutenant. I could be wrong.
Well, definitely won't. But yeah, so what Akbar says is Celsius should be a colonel, Hobby and Davidson should be majors, Horn should be a captain at the very least, Darklighter as well, and the rest of your rogues should be something other than flight officers. Except,
most of them are lieutenants already.
Min is already a lieutenant. He was a lieutenant.
Min better have gotten the bump to captain, is all I have to say.
So he wasn't a flight officer then.
Min had already gone up to brevet captain and then bumped back down.
Akbar didn't need to know all the details, I guess.
I feel like most of the rogues probably went up to captain. I would like to think that Ural, and we know that Iniri makes it up to a much higher rank. We'll see that later in the expanded X-Wing series that we will get to. Very excited about that. But we don't know exactly how high she goes here. My guess is she goes to captain, but it's possible she just goes to lieutenant.
Yeah. For a moment, I think that's what I had in my little writing.
But I feel like both of us feel that Min should go up to captain, right?
Yeah. He can take the brevet off. He's earned it. Plus, he's not going to be around in service while he's on his way out. Is my interpretation.
He theoretically could go all the way until most of the rogues retire in Vision of the Future, but most fans think that he left early. I can't remember when Alston said he retired. I think he said it was relatively soon after this period.
Yeah, one round of thinking he died is enough.
So that's basically just us nerding out as fans of military fiction and real life military stuff and fans of these characters. It's fun to figure out what people's ranks are, even though Stackpole once again forgets to tell us things, although he does finally tell us who leads 2 flight. In this case, it's Jansen. And Stackpole does goof up, although maybe it's because it's Booster, but he says that Wes is a captain, even though he should be a major.
Well, this is Wes we're talking about. If anybody's getting demoted.
Now, do you feel that there's a relatively smooth transition from Solo Command to Isard's Revenge? So if you were, let's say you'd already read the Thrawn trilogy, because most people start with the Thrawn trilogy. If you'd already read the Thrawn trilogy, do you feel that someone who's just like, oh, the X-Wing series, and just go books 1 through 9, and they read Solo Command and Isard's Revenge, basically read next to each other, do you think it's a smooth transition, or how do you feel that goes?
That is what I did as a kid. And I still haven't read Courtship or Tatooine Ghost, or, well, there's not really anything else between them novel-wise that I can think of.
Yeah, I appreciate the fact that Stackpole puts in these connective pieces. Like, he talks about Wedge and Akbar's Ray Squadron bet. He talks about Min being part of the Rogues, because that was one of the last things that happened in Solo Command. So it does feel like it's part of the same series. Some people get a little cranky that Stackpole doesn't do more with the Wraith stuff when Alston did a ton with the Rogue stuff, but I don't know. Would I like to have seen more Wraith stuff, Wraith connections? Yes. Am I mad? No. I think this is a perfectly fun novel that develops all the stuff that Stackpole had done, both the novels and the comics.
And it leaves us to imagine what the Wraiths could have been doing during these books.
Yes. So, if you're a crazy person and you talk to me and I say, read the X-Wing books first, would you advise them to read the Thrawn trilogy between Solo Command and Isard's Revenge.
Yeah, just because of how good the Thrawn trilogy is, and to get the picture of just how much damage the New Republic military has taken.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think that Stackpole and Alston really focused on trying to build this picture of the New Republic slowly gaining in legitimacy until you get that where Zahn starts Heir to the Empire. The New Republic is basically not fully at peace, but it's the dominant superpower of the galaxy. It controls the core. It's very prosperous. They're expanding all the time with peaceful diplomatic missions, and then Thrawn just cuts a swath through their territory.
Yeah.
So I think that's a great arc. And of course, Stackpole in particular just seeded in all the Katana fleet and outbound flights and all these references that pay off in the Thrawn trilogy. So I think if you were a crazy person and started with the X-Wing series, it would be a fun thing to read the first 7, read the Thrawn trilogy, and then Isard's Revenge. It would feel not seamless because they're different styles, but it would work. It would be a fun reading experience.
Yeah, Garm Belibulus being back in the New Republic is a big part of Isard's Revenge as well.
Yes. And that transitions to the next continuity point, which is there are so many Timothy Zahn references in this book. Obviously, you've got the first chapter being entirely the Last Command battle. Wraith mentioned that is clearly written after the Hand of Thrawn because he seeds in all these Kamasi and Bothan and all these references that are paid off in Spectre of the Past and Vision of the Future. You've got references to Last Command in things like the Corvus Minor, the Nogri helping the New Republic, and of course the Thrawn tactic of the gravity well pincer, where you have a gravity well generator and you have your ships jump to it so they can get right in range and blast away.
Yeah, which Akbar, that's the thing he reverses on Krenel. He was, throughout the books, been thinking about how much smarter he is than Thrawn.
Whereas we all can see that Krenel is actually just kind of a thug who likes to hit things. He's not very smart.
And there's a bit of backstory where Thrawn cut off Krenel's hand. Or had somebody do it for him. And so that's
because Krenel destroyed a planet, and
yeah,
Thrawn was like, that's not okay. There is a big retcon first introduced in the Essential Chronology by Daniel Wallace and Kevin J. Anderson that Isard was attempting to steal the Lusankya because she wanted to prove herself to the reborn emperor.
Is that? I didn't realize that was an official retcon.
I'm pretty sure that's in the chronology.
I mean, you would know more than I would. I just thought about it from the standpoint of, I know Stackpole isn't a big fan of Dark Empire, if I remember right.
This is not a Dark Empire fan podcast.
Right, including things. I just think it works from the standpoint of she knows Palpatine's coming back.
It does work. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about the characters, particularly Isard. And I also forgot to mention there's a bunch of stuff with Card connecting with Booster again. So that's a fun little Zahn reference. So just all the Zahn references. Now, one thing I noticed is in Iron Fist, and to some extent Solo Command, and in Isard's Revenge, you have people who are attempting to take over or destroy a Superstar Destroyer from the inside. And how do you feel like Shala's perspective in taking over the Razor's Kiss versus Stackpole writing Isard taking over the Lusankya with her commandos?
Well, I mean, we don't really see the details of how Isard's people are doing it here. They have it kind of easier, or they think they do, because Lusankya has been under repair and seemingly at a secure location rather than being constructed and almost ready to go. But I am really curious what Kraken's reaction to finding out that Booster's solution to preventing Isard was to take command of the Lusankya himself. Because that could have gotten a whole lot worse for the New Republic.
I think Stackpole. I almost feel like this novel had too many plots. Like, I feel like the Isard returning plot could have been a whole plot, and then the Krennel plot could have been a whole book. And there's so many things, like the death of Jansen. Like, he doesn't die, but Wedge thinks he dies. There's all these things that you're like, this could have been so much bigger, but because there's so many ideas and this is a relatively short book, it gets kind of rushed through.
Yeah, we don't even find out, or the rogues don't even see real Isard until over halfway through the book.
Yeah.
I'd forgotten just how like elongated the first half is and compressed the second one is.
Well, it's because there's lots of fun battles and setting up stuff.
Yeah.
Stackpole and Alston also have a very big difference in how they kind of portray the action happening. Alston tends to have the fleet trying to find engagements rather than being able to set up missions. Whereas Stackpole's like, here's our mission, and we're going to train for like a week in specific simulators to do that mission. And so it's very different. Like, Stackpole's like roving carriers across the ocean of space, whereas Stackpole's like, we have our set bases and we're going to hit targets hard. So it's kind of that soft versus hard versus open, great powers warfare versus asymmetrical warfare. There's like all these interesting concepts that happen. And you have cool things like on the Komanor mission, the X-Wings get painted black. Do they really explain that? Is it just because that Komanor is technically a neutral planet, so they don't want New Republic colors flying?
Yeah, I think that was part of it.
We of course have the great battle versus the AT-ATs that's on the cover. I'm very curious to know if Stackpole wrote like an outline, and then Paul Ewell's like, I want to draw those X-Wings versus AT-ATs. And then Stackpole's like, oh gosh, I got to write more about the X-Wings versus AT-ATs.
It also raised one of my original trilogy unanswerable questions of, so the Rebels' plan on Hoth was to engage in snowspeeders, then fall back and have the pilots get in their X-Wings. Why not just send the X-Wings out the entire time?
I mean, you could... I mean, this doesn't actually make sense because space is colder than Hoth.
Yeah.
I feel like
there's no way Hoth is that so cold.
But like, you can argue the X-Wings aren't ready for extended snow campaigns, which I think is a stupid thing, but maybe that's the argument.
That's the only thing I've been able to think of. Or
like,
they were worried sending out X-Wings but bringing TIE fighters, so they didn't want to risk that. But yeah, I don't get that part.
I mean, it's just kind of this. It's kind of the same problem that I have with A New Hope. I understand why they have a trench, because the technological limitations at the time were such that you had to have a trench so the camera could go through it, and that's how you film it. It makes no sense that you would go into a trench and go through it for miles while TIE fighters and emplacements fire on you. Instead, you should fly in an evasive spiral until you get to the closest point where you can come in, launch your torps, and come out. It should basically just be zoop, fire, and leave. It shouldn't be this extended 5-minute thing where you just go through the trench and you're a sitting duck. But the point of that is the tension. In the same way, the point of the snowspeeder battle on Hoth is the tension and the loss and the sense of being overwhelming odds. Whereas if you had X-Wings, they would literally just blow off the heads of all the walkers and the rebels would win. But then, of course, probably if you had the X-Wings, then the Empire would be like, we got to launch our TIEs, and the Super Star Destroyer has 120 TIEs, and that would completely wipe out the X-Wings. So it's part of the budget and the conception, but I do agree it is a problem.
Maybe they didn't want to use up all the TIE or the X-Wing weapons. Like, they don't use the concussion missiles on the AT. Yeah. Let's not get bogged down. Yeah. The other thing is just the general modern warfare stood out in Isard's Revenge compared to some of the other books? If you want to go over those points first.
Yeah, I feel like in the first 7 X-Wing books, there's more of a World War II vibe to it. Stackpole talks a lot about how he watched a lot of documentaries about the World War II pilots. Not a lot about how he talked to Korean or Vietnam War pilots, or even like the NATO pilots who were flying in Kosovo and Yugoslavia at the time. And Alston talks about how Solo Command's final battle is very much about the sense of the Battle of Midway, where there's all this confusion and you don't have perfect intel because of all the asteroids or clouds or things getting in the way of your sensors. This book feels very much like it's trying to be, honestly, 1990s level jets and helicopter attacks. You have, Wedge coming in and providing ground support like a helicopter, taking out ground emplacements and troops. You've got ground-based missile launchers, the PLX-2, which, as we mentioned, you can play in Battlefront 2, the 2005 version, which they call chips, which I thought was fun. You get hit by a chip. Which sounds cute, but you don't want it to happen. Corrin's X-Wing gets really chewed up by it. A lot of talk about logistics and resupplying and supply lines, which we do have a bit in Kratos Trap and Back to War, but I feel is a bit more prevalent here. Although we do have a callback to World War II stuff with a note that Wraith talked about Corrin.
Yeah, well, it's World War II. It's a common World War II movie trope, but I'm sure it's around more than that, where he's got an image of his wife in the cockpit.
Lastly, Stackpole said that he included the TIE Defender in this novel because he really liked the TIE Fighter game. He thought it was actually a better game. And most people who have played it, I have not actually played TIE Fighter, but most people who have played TIE Fighter say that TIE Fighter is a significantly better game, which makes sense. They were building and learning so much after the first game. And of course, the TIE Defender is the crowning jewel of the TIE Fighter game. Although I think some people say that the missile boat is the crowning jewel. I don't know. But who wants to fly a missile boat versus a TIE Defender? Come on, TIE Defenders look awesome.
They do. And we get a nickname for them, the Trip.
Yes, because of the 3 wings. Sort of like an interceptor, but they're going outside instead of inside. And I wish the Micro Galaxy Squadrons would do a TIE Defender. I mean, the TIE Defender was in Rebels. The TIE Defender was in the Battlefront 2 new game, the Disney era game. So the TIE Defender, and it was in the Squadrons video game. So I feel like TIE Defender is well known. And Action Fleet did a TIE Defender back in the 90s. Why don't we have a TIE Defender now
Well,
that I can buy for less than $300?
I think in X-Wing miniatures.
Yes, I mean I do have the TIE Defender and the Royal Guard TIE Defender in the X-Wing miniatures, but I would like. Wait, do I have the Royal Guard?
I think they only made a Royal Guard Interceptor.
They did. They made a 181st and a Royal Guard Interceptor, but they also made a Red Defender, and I can't remember if I bought it or not. I bought the Red Interceptors, but I didn't get every skin in the X-Wing miniatures game because they're expensive.
Yeah,
but very cool ships. If you like miniatures, they're worth it just for the miniatures. It's a fun game. I don't like the new rules, but I understand why they're made. But let's move on to more Isard's Revenge talk with our character questions, our second section, characters. And our first subsection, of course, is our heroes. So unlike the first couple of Stackpole books, we get a lot more point of views. Of course, we get our Corrin and our Wedge, and we get our villains with, I think Krenel is the biggest villain point of view. I think you sometimes get Isard, but it's mostly Krenel who's the villain point of view, like Kirtan Lure or Fleury Voru was in the original X-Wing series.
There's really only, because I checked, like one real passage for real Isard and one real point of view passage for fake Isard.
Yeah.
Or clone Isard.
Stackpole doesn't write from Isard's point of view very often. I think trying to keep her as a more scary character, because it's like Darth Vader. If Darth Vader's talking all the time, whether it's in his head or to other characters, he's less scary. But if he's just this silent guy who goes around killing people, that is scary.
In the trilogy, Zahn doesn't really give Thrawn's point of view either, right?
Correct. The only time
It's
I think
always
he's
Conan
given
or
Thrawn's character
Sabas.
is 2017. So it's a tried and true tactic in villains to not give them a point of view, but giving kind of a sidekick or a side villain's point of view that gives you more suspense. It also gives you more suspense because you don't know what the main villain is planning, so that gives you more of a surprise.
But yeah, hero wise, we get a whole range.
Yeah, we get a whole 2 chapters from Whistler's point of view in The Great Droid Escape. We get some Murex and Ayala point of view, which we'll talk about a bit later. We get some Booster point of view, some Phalia point of view.
We get Phalia getting beaten up by Booster point of view, which is
awesome point of view. Lots of point of view. I think it's honestly, even though I don't dislike Corran, I think it's too heavily Corran point of view. I think that's mostly because that's who Stackpole was comfortable writing as, because he'd done it so much by this point. It was kind of natural. But he does branch out quite a lot.
It could be like a retrograde thing from having written his last thing, not only in Corran point of view, but in first person Corran point of view.
Yeah, well, and that's why I think it's most comfortable, because he spent so much time developing Corran as a person. He can just do it. It's like a muscle. He's done it for 5 books. He'll do it for a 6th.
But now he's moving further away from that.
Yeah, thankfully. And again, not that I dislike Corran. I like Corran. I just feel like I like the more ensemble point of view. Which I'm going to be a huge hypocrite about and not complain at all about in our next X-Wing book. But, oh shoot, I should have moved this. This is not a character thing. This is continuity thing. But I have to mention it. I am really irritated, and this is not just a Stackpole thing, but too many authors were obsessed with having the Rebels fly Star Destroyers, either captured or newly created Star Destroyers. And I get it that Star Destroyers are the most visually iconic. We see them in all 3 of the original trilogy, but I love Mon Cal cruisers. I feel like Mon Cal cruisers should have been the ship, and Imperial Star Destroyers should have been supporting ships for the New Republic. And it really annoys me that you really only see Home 1 in this book. Everything else is some version of Star Destroyer, whether it's a Victory Star Destroyer or an Imperial Class 2 Star Destroyer or the Super Star Destroyer.
They could have given us Mon Ramonda back one last time.
Yeah. I'm still angry about that stupid retcon.
Not the only stupid retcon we're talking about.
Oh, yes. Question for Wraith. Is this the most Ayala point of view and action that we see in any book?
Proportionally, I would say yes. I think Back to War might have more, but it's also longer.
I feel that Back to War only really has 3 Ayala sections.
I'm just thinking of the amount of stuff she does on the ground after Corran's left, because we don't really see it from Elskull's point of view.
Yeah, but we only see the raid on the Dalaric compound. We see the Imperial attack on the Vratix compound. And then we see the final assault and capture of Voru. Those are really the only scenes we have from her in Back to War, from her point of view.
Yeah, and I guess the stuff on Commodore, that actually is from her view, not Merrick's. So yeah, I think this wins.
And this one, she's got more agency because she's not as devastated. Like, her entire point of view in Back to War is quite naturally, she is so devastated by having to kill her husband. And that makes sense. But, like, this is kind of Ayala being Jane Bond, you know? Ayala, the super spy, the super analyst, the super case officer, is very cool. She gets lots of gadgets. And I wish we'd gotten more of this because she's such a fun character. And I think this is really, like, normal Ayala. Like, this is Ayala as she's supposed to be.
Yeah, there's a bit where Isard is real Isard, after being caught on Lusankia, taunts Ayala about how easy her interrogators broke Derek, and Ayala's response is a flat rather than emotional, which Isard was expecting. Shut up.
Yep.
Like that.
She's great in this book. I wish we'd gotten more of this Ayala, because Ayala honestly doesn't have much of a character in Wedge's Gamble or Krytos' Trap. Well, maybe a little more in Krytos' Trap, but she's mostly like concerned about Derek and trying to figure out what's going on with Tycho as the investigator for the prosecutor. Yeah. I don't know. I feel like Ayala is a character of enormous potential, but very rarely used super well.
I agree.
Do you feel that there's much Wedge and Ayala romance in this book? I feel like they're more friends. I don't get a lot of attraction in this one.
I think since, well, less than half, but quite a bit of time has her thinking he's dead. You know, like you see Mirex's grief, and then you can kind of see the setup that Ayala's mourning what could have been, in addition to thinking Corin's dead as well, her friend.
Yeah. Again, this is a book that I feel like probably should have been longer, because that's huge emotional stuff, and you just kind of get glossed over.
Yeah, I mean, you've read my stuff for this, where they've got the whole rogue's funeral and whatnot.
Yeah.
I think we could have seen more, but then that would have made the book longer, which it could have stood to have done, but yeah.
Gavin and Isard probably have the biggest emotional arc. I would say that they have the biggest emotional arc of the book.
Yeah.
But they've got like 3 points of view of the entire book. I don't even think we get an Isard point of view, because she's mostly seen by Phalia or by Gavin.
Yeah, I was going to say, even when there's the scenes about how Borsk is going to keep her from having kids, we see it from Borsk's view.
Yeah.
Which,
why? He's the worst. She does, like, I love the parts where she's just flying her heart out and just vaping everything. Like, Stackpole really pours a lot into showing how cool of a pilot she is. So that is cool, but of course very tragic, because that is also how she gets killed, because she gets so involved that she misses the bomber that collides with her. Gavin, of course, has the emotional arc of being ready to commit and wanting to have kids, and then losing it all. Now, here's a controversial question that I just thought of while we were plotting this podcast. I think that Isard should have actually died, because she doesn't actually accomplish anything, and her being alive and leaving Gavin almost feels worse than her being dead.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to spoil DC Comics now that I've read some of them for people who haven't, but I think you know what comparison is in my mind right now.
Are we talking about a certain Black Queen?
Maybe.
Yes. Very similar feeling.
Not on should have stayed dead, but on how the arc is similar.
Yeah, very sad and tragic. And actually made someone from our Discord server so upset that I don't know if they've ever read further in the X-Wing series, which I got irritated with. But I understand. I do feel really sad about how their romance ends, because it is just tragic.
Yeah, it would have been better if we'd seen like a follow-up Isard story.
Yeah, and I'm sure that Stackpole would have loved to write one, but he never wrote another novel after New Jedi Order. For Star Wars. He wrote like dozens of novels after that.
Right.
To be clear. Corin, does he have an arc here?
I mean, he comes to terms with the fact that Erlora's death wasn't his fault.
Yeah, that's
And
not
that
really an arc.
also, yeah, it's like the most development he really has. He also gets beaten up by a Rhodian and a group of children.
Big tough X-wing pilot. Yeah, I feel like Corrin's dominance and point of view here is still more just because Stackpole is comfortable with him. And it's not bad. It's very functional, but he doesn't. He could be a supporting character in this book, and I think it would be better. Like if Gavin were the main character in this book, I think it actually would have been stronger because he does have this huge emotional arc, and maybe that would have made the book too sad. But I don't know. I think it could have. I think it could have worked. Speaking of sad people, Nrin Vakil, our favorite Quarren pilot from the Rogue Squadron comics, shows up about halfway through the book and is very cool. He flies the X-Wing Recon. He has his tragic backstory with falling in love with Ibtissim and then her dying in the fight against Krenel. And I remember him when I was a kid and I first read this. I remember him being a bigger thing in my head. I felt he was a cooler character, and I had only read a couple of the comics, but that included Mandatory Retirement, so I knew how his journey ended, which made it feel very appropriate for this book, which of course is picking up the lost thread of Krenel taking over St. Bastage's planets, and now they're taking those planets away from him because he's terrible.
I mean, he also heavily foreshadows what's going to happen with Gavin and Isard.
Yes. Very sad. I like Nrin a lot. I think he's used pretty well. I would have loved more, but I think he's good.
It would have been good to see him in the other Quarren talk, if only to see the other Quarren talk.
At all. Instead of none. Now, Tycho, one of my personal absolute favorite characters, and I think Wraith too, because he's an A-Wing pilot.
Not just because of that, but it helps.
I mean, he's just a wonderful character. He's Captain Alderaan, noble and true. He doesn't have a ton to do because he's not suspected of murder, and he doesn't have to go back to Alderaan to leave presents for his dead family.
But he is from Alderaan, and he remembers what the guy Krenel talks about was actually like.
Yeah. And we get confirmation that Tycho still wears a black flight suit. Everybody else wears orange, but he wears black. Well, and it's funny.
Does Corrin wear green, though?
I don't know.
3.75 figures of dubious accuracy aside.
Yes. Well, that one also has Corrin flying E-Wings all the time, which I guess it makes sense from the Rogue Wing period, but come on, man. But it's funny because when the Rogues go undercover and they're training with Isard's people, Tycho still has all his rebel patches. So he's got his big Coruscant patch. And Corrin thinks that was Gaul, the Imperials. And I thought that was very funny. Now, let's talk about our one Wraith Squadron member, Min Donos. I thought it was really fun as a huge fan of Wraith Squadron, a huge fan of his journey, especially in Solo Command, that you get to see him here in Isard's Revenge as a rogue. He mostly gets talked about as the round-faced Min Donos because Stackpole loves his quick description identifiers of the pilots. And then he has one comment in the discussion about Krenel's propaganda where he says one of the race is from Taprawa, and that, of course, is Tyria Sarkin. And he says, why aren't we liberating Taprawa instead of taking the Saitric hegemony? And then Tycho's like, no, Krenel's bad. Because of Tycho, of course, along with Wedge, Hobby, Wes, and Nrin, were the only rogues in this book who were also in the comics who fought Krenel before, and so have more of a personal stake of how evil Krenel is.
I just think the stated justification of he killed Bastage, so we're going after him is. I could see the point that's thin.
I mean, that's kind of. It does feel very real world. It feels like the kind of thing that you'd use as a public relations justification for why you're spending an enormous amount of money taking out someone who's not attacking you.
Yeah.
I do think it does really irritate me that no one ever wrote a story where they saved Taprawa, because Taprawa's devastation by the Empire and the cruelty of how the Empire treated the Taprawans is just unacceptable. And the rebels, as soon as they could have, I think, should have liberated that planet. Now, maybe there's a galactic map justification. Maybe it's so deeply into Imperial territory that you can't take it and hold it. Like there's no supply lines. But it's so evil what the Empire did to the Taprawans. It really does irritate me that they never wrote the story or even mentioned that Taprawa was actually freed at a period of time. I think the Wook says it was, but there's no story about it. How do you feel about how Min is used in Isard's Revenge?
Overall, I think it's good. It would have been funny if there'd been like an indirect Lara reference.
I would have liked that. I would have also liked it if they'd had a reference to his sniper ability. Like if he'd landed with Corrin and Ren and he'd done sniper backup. I think that would have been fun. It feels like, and this is probably the case because this was literally released only 2 months after Solo Command. So it's quite possible it was being written at the same time as Solo Command. So all Stackpole really knew is that Min was going to be in Rogue Squadron. He didn't want to step on any character toes that Alston wrote. I think it's fine. It makes me very happy that he's here. It makes me very happy that he wasn't killed off. I will say, back when I first read this, I was on the edge of my seat, worried that Stackpole would kill Min because Alston killed Taldira, and I was worried that he was going to go back and forth and kill off the character that the previous author introduced into Rogue Squadron. But he didn't. Min survives, thankfully. And if you are a fan of Rogue Squadron fanfiction, there is a whole series called Dono Slaying Excursions, which is now available on Archive of Our Own, AO3. It was originally posted on the Jedi Council forums of theforce.net, but those are really hard to navigate, and a lot of them are gone now, so I'm glad that it's on AO3. And it talks a lot about how Min's resignation could have gone and how it really draws an arc between Solo Command and Isard's Revenge and Min's motivations. In my opinion, it gets a little bit too 2004 political for me, but it makes sense, and I think it's a reasonable way to flesh out Min's arc.
Yeah, I mean, I did some of that myself by inference.
Well, I read them in 2004, so
right.
I remember what it was like politically back then.
I just meant the Min's arc stuff.
Yes. Now, one of my absolute favorites, and one of the reasons I actually really like Isard's Revenge, is the Great Droid Escape with Whistler and Gate. You have so much personality. It's just 2 chapters, but so much personality for these little droids. They're just thinking it's like the Tonin stuff in Solo Command, but very different personality. Very fun. And I love that Gate, the first thing Gate says is, "I don't waste my processing time on calculating odds," because he's a Corellian astromech.
Yeah, that raised a question that we'll talk about later, I guess.
Oh, we will?
Well, you have it later on about the others. Or we can talk about it now. It's down a few paragraphs after the...
Where's the... Oh, yeah. Let's talk about it now.
Okay. So, yeah, the question I had after reading that is, man, what happened to all the other droids? And now that I think about it, the X-Wings that they flew or had tractored by the Defenders into Isard's secret base.
Well, we know from the Dark Tide books that Gavin gets his astromech back, because he specifically talks about how this is the same astromech that he had in Back to War. So we know he gets his back. My theory is the Rogues defenders have Isard's base in their navigational computers, so they just lead the New Republic task force to that base and get all their stuff back. Maybe take
or Whistler would know if he knew a way to get out. Then I think he would know find out where he was in the process of that.
Yeah. So that's probably the other thing they did between Isard's Revenge and Dark Empire, is getting their stuff back.
Because I was thinking, like, man, Min's droid, obviously not Shiner, but whatever. I forget the name of the second one.
I feel like he did have a name. Was it Clink?
I know one of them was Clink.
Well, Shiner is the original, the one who was in Talon Squadron.
Right.
So I think Clink is the second astromech. Now we get to a very controversial thing. Arita Bell. Let's talk about Arita Bell and how we feel about her, and then a very bad thing that happened.
Yeah, so we see. Sorry, I'm so. Yeah, okay, yeah, that was Clink. Was his. So Arita is introduced and only seen novel-wise in this one as the navigator of one of the transports in The Empire Strikes Back, fleeing Hoth, specifically the one that I think it was Wedge and Hobby escorted out.
I think that's right.
I know Wedge was the one escorting.
Yeah, it was definitely Wedge. I don't remember if it was Hobby or Tycho or who.
And now she's an admiral commanding one of the New Republic Star Destroyers in the engagement. We get some of her point of view during the battle to take Lineage 3. And there's a scene of the first briefing where Wedge is talking to her, introducing himself, and she's like, "Oh, I know who you are." And what Corellian doesn't, and then he recognizes her from Hoth, and she's surprised he remembers her, type of thing. I was like, there's some flirting going on.
I mean, you do wonder, because Stackpole does do his thing and describe what she looks like. There's so much personality in just these two scenes with her that she just stuck in my head as, oh, she was a really cool admiral. She was a cool Victory Star Destroyer captain. And then in 2013, a book called The Essential Guide to Warfare came out, and it had a section called The Battle of Orinda, in which they fleshed out one sentence from the Black Fleet Crisis, where the Endurance-class fleet carrier, the first vessel of its kind, was wiped out at the Battle of Orinda because the commander, explicitly called a he, was too nervous to launch all the fighters at the beginning of the battle. And so it retcons into a she and makes Arita Bell into this hesitant commander who gets wiped out and all her starfighters are destroyed because she refuses to order them into battle. And this pisses me off so much because, number one, come on, just use one of those Crayfay nephews from Krytos Trap. Come on, do some other character who we don't care about. Don't kill off Arita Bell, who's a very cool character and who's explicitly, in both scenes she's in, shown to be extremely bold. She takes risks. She gets the job done. She's not the kind of person who's just going to hesitate and be too conservative and cautious about ordering her fighters into battle. It's just nonsense.
And it's established that the commander was male.
And it was a male. And I understand they want to add more gender balance, but you add gender balance to kill them off? That's not gender balance. That's more dead ladies.
Yeah, I mean, you know how I've tried to headcanon fix that.
I mean, if you want to read someone who worked really hard to both respect Arita's character and stay within established expanded universe canon, Wraith has written probably the best justification of it. It still makes me too upset.
But my version is that the hangar doors got stuck like one starfighter wide. So they could only launch one at a time and they'd be sitting ducks. And so that's why they got held back until the doors could be opened, which sadly wasn't possible before destruction.
Before it got a full Superstar Destroyer barrage to the chest.
And on that lovely note, we have even more red shirts, who we've already talked about somewhat.
Yeah, we have our Quarren lady, Lurs Atok, and our reptile guy, Kijin Slee, who is an Isori, not an Ishori. I think an Ishori would have been more fun, but he couldn't have his weird reptile egg conversation because they're not reptiles. I will say, Stackpole at least does develop Kijin as a character. You remember him because of his weird egg thing. But that's all he does. We also have a bunch of also their pilots who maybe have one or two lines or appearances. We have Iniri Forge, Hobby, Wes, Nawara Ven, who I don't think even really shows up.
I think he's just at the party.
Yeah, he and Rossetti are both at the party. And then Ural, who's Corrin's Gand roommate. I love all these characters and wish there had been more. I do appreciate that Stackpole did develop characters in more ways. And I do think that Hobby and Wes's banter when they get promoted, where someone asked Wes if he was happy to be promoted to, is it 3 pips on the major rank? Or 4? It's 3.
Whichever one.
4 is Colonel.
Hobby's surprised he could count.
And then Hobby jumps in and says, "We didn't think he'd live to count to 3." I thought that was actually pretty good Hobby Wes banter, imitating Alston's Hobby and Wes relationship.
I'm trying to find where it is, but there's somewhere, I think near the end, where Oral gets a really good dig in on Corrin.
He actually gets a couple. I remember when he in the conversation about, actually in the first party, Ural talks about how he's learned so much, but not from Corrin.
Noreen tells Corrin often. Corrin said he was an idiot, and then Noreen says, "For an idiot, you seem to think well. First time for everything," and apparently that's Oral's line.
Yeah. Now let's move to our subsection about our villains. And interestingly, whereas most of the villains in the original 4 X-Wing books are pretty sociopathic, Kirtan Lure is incredibly narcissistic, and I don't know if I'd say he's a sociopath, but he does not really care about killing people. Hassan Isard, of course, is super evil. Fleary Voro sees everyone as a tool and a pawn and does not care. And Risi Delaret, when we finally get her point of view, is like, she's like pure what's that philosophy? Utilitarianism. Like, if you can't survive, if you can't make it in the economy, you might as well die.
And we know how Voru sees her.
Yes. That was not great. So all of the Imperials in the original X-Wing books, they might have some interesting, like, they tend to be smart, like Voru and Lure are smart, but they don't really have many virtues. Whereas in this one, we get, apart from our main 3 villains, the Isard clone, and Krenel, all of our Imperials tend to be more complex and more sympathetic. And I think that's an interesting choice. We've got, of course, Colonel Broek Vessery. He's the leader and trainer of the TIE Defender squadrons, and he is consistently portrayed as an honorable man, a man who wants to protect people and isn't interested in slaughter, although he does. And I think the idea is that he is just doing his best under the commanders who obtain him. So he's not quite ambitious enough to try and set up his own world where he can rule more justly, but he does try and treat the people under his command justly. So I think that's an interesting portrayal of an ambiguous or sympathetic villainous figure. Do you have any comments about Vestry? You do have a comment about Vestry.
I thought it was funny that this just stood out for a while. So when Wedge first meets Cal Tainer in Wraith Squadron, he describes him as like, this guy with his dark hair, he could be on like a recruitment poster. And that's almost exactly how Vesser is described by Wedge again here, point of view wise. Although I think his hair is like slightly starting to gray, something like that, which makes sense.
I think you're right.
As an Imperial colonel.
Yeah. You have the commander at Linane 3 who is, interestingly, he doesn't like alien-human integration, so he's a bit of a speciesist, but he hates murder, so he refuses to murder aliens as well. So I thought that was a very interesting character.
Is that the guy that just gets told to wipe out a village and
yes,
does so 12 hours after telling them he's going to wipe it out?
Yeah, so he deliberately and consciously helps them to escape and then follows the orders. So he's able, and he likes to save crewmen because Krenel, of course, is this narcissist who requires everyone to fawn over him. And so this Star Destroyer captain just transfers all the people who don't want to fawn over Krenel to his Star Destroyer because he knows that they're interested in doing their best job instead of just toadying up to this corrupt narcissist.
And I think it said he got the command after Krenel executed the previous one who wouldn't destroy the village.
Yes. So he refuses to go along with the murder, but he's also cunning and smart. But he also still doesn't really like aliens. At least he prefers aliens to be over there and not with his family. So it's an interesting juxtaposition. I'm not sure you'd get that kind of nuance today. This guy has stuck in my head because it's an interesting portrait of someone who he believes in segregation, but he's very against what we call hate crimes or judicial murder. But let's go on to someone who is outright portrayed as a Klan member. He literally talks about how he loved killing aliens and burning their houses with his dad as a kid. And he loves murdering people. He thinks that Thrawn is inferior because he's an alien, and he just sees that Thrawn was so much smarter than he was. Dilak Krenel, the self-styled Prince Admiral of Sayatric, is a murderous, brutal, and very stupid thug
who dies when a concussion missile smashes through the glass or transparent steel of the bridge of Krenel's ship, showering him with glass all over. So he's bleeding everywhere but his mechanical arm. And he has just enough time to realize that before the missile blows up.
And then he gets totally vaporized. And it was very satisfying because every time Krenel is on screen, he's just like, murder, 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 murder. I love to murder. And so when he dies, you're just like, my goodness, it was the worst.
The blast could have blown him out into space for a bit first, but
I don't know about that. I feel like taking a concussion missile to the face, he's just in millions of molecules all over the place. Now, we have our villain of 5 books, and the book is, of course, titled Isard's Revenge. Do you feel that this is a fitting end to the Isard saga?
Yeah, I mean, it was lampshaded that this could happen in Iron Fist or Solo Command, I think. I think it's Solo Command.
No, it's Iron Fist.
Okay. The possibility that she's still alive. But, yeah, I mean, the benefit here is now both Wedge and Iola get to claim they've taken down one Isard. That even gets referenced in when Wedge is asking Ayala to be his date to have to sit at a table full of senators right after the end of the book. But yeah, I think it's fitting.
I think it's fitting. She's a
There's
lot smarter here than she was in Back to War. I mean, one of my few complaints about Back to War is she's really dumb in Back to War. And I understand that it's 12 starfighters against a superstar destroyer. She's really dumb.
Yeah. And she even kind of acknowledges that. Of course, there's the ambiguous element to the ending.
Well,
but I'm not
let's have a
saying
little
I
discussion.
believe it happened. I just think it's funny that the door is somewhat left open on
Well,
whether
I'm
or
not
not.
convinced that the door is left open because I was rereading this afternoon, and I was like, so Wraith, go through your theory, and then I'll explain why I think that the theory doesn't really make sense to me.
So there's basically we see Isard's point of view, and she gets shot in the stomach by Ayala, and then it fades to black. But then Ayala is talking to Corin about Lusancia and how there's this one section that her understanding is they're going to use it for biotech research, but which is ironic given Kratos virus and all that. They have it set up where just to make sure nothing could go wrong, there's this one section accessible only to droids where if it's being breached, it would immediately vent the contents into space, which makes sense for biotech. But when Ayala has Isard at blaster point, and Isard is taunting, well, you can't afford to have a public trial, I know too much. Ayala just points out, we can try you in military court for piracy. There'll be no publicity to it, and I understand the idea is that we're going to imprison you here, aboard Lusancia, which is so terrifying. Yeah, she says you'll be an anonymous prisoner cared for by droids, forgotten, locked away in the very heart of the prison you created for the rest of your natural life. And I start so shocked and terrified of that she tries to draw, even though Ayala's already got her blaster leveled, get shot. But then Ayala says to Corin, I'm looking this up here. Yeah. Corin says, I wonder if Isard will end up haunting this place. And Ayala says, I have no doubt part of her will always be with the Lusancia. And there's a section that, is it's isolated. Nobody can get to it. If anybody tries to get to it, they launch it into space. So I think my view is that leaves the possibility she could have survived being shot in the gut, because lots of people have, and they just locked her up there. And nobody knew about it except Ayala and Kraken.
I think that you can definitely argue that. My problem with that is that would require so much medical treatment, because it's not ambiguous that Isard gets shot with an actual blast. It's not a stun bolt because there's a hole in her stomach. She's got blood everywhere. She is very clearly dying. So she would have to have very quick, very intense medical treatment. And given that it's basically just the four of them, maybe the medical section has an instant back tank that they could just dump her in with droids. But I think it's stretching it a little too far for me to believe that anything other than Isard just dies at the end of this book is how it was intended to be. Now, I did ask Stackpole on Twitter, but he never answered me. It's possible he's gone to other social medias.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying she survived. I just think it's possible, and it would be kind of funny. I've made the allusion to if you've seen Star Trek: The Wrath of Khan, Khan's line about buried alive. forever and flipped it around to refer to Derek.
Yeah. So that brings us to our final section of analysis, which is our literary questions. So, first question is, this is our 8th book in the series, but it feels like most people kind of remember the first 7 books really well, and then they remember book 9 really well. But Isard's Revenge doesn't get a lot of love or memory. Why do you think that is?
I mean, it's in this kind of weird space between Thrawn and Dark Empire, 2 series that did not mesh well. I'll just put it that way. I mean, it's not like really having stuff that's essential to the overall Galactic Civil War either. I mean, Isard coming back could have been a big thing, but it all gets resolved and wrapped up here. The big thing is that Lasaki is being restored to operational status, but we already knew that from it showing up in Crimson Empire. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of suffers from being self-contained.
Yeah, and it's very like filling in the gaps between other major events. Like it's setting up other events without necessarily paying off its own events. And it does pay off. I do think it pays off Krenel and Isard reasonably well. But it's tricky because it's a pretty short novel, and it's not quite book 5 of Back to War. It's almost that, but it's not quite that. So I think it's kind of trying to do too many things and in a very short amount of space, so it can't quite do them all. So that's why I think it's not quite as remembered or beloved by many. Although I am going to argue that it is very much the parts are greater than the whole in this book. But those parts, like the droid escape and the Ayala sections and Gavin's arc, they're great. They're really awesome.
Yeah.
Now, how standalone is Isard's Revenge? Could you hand this to someone and just say, start here?
Maybe start right after Bobringy. That might make it more standalone. And just go over the basics of Thrawn's been defeated. This is what we know so far.
I mean, I feel like the answer is it's not. This is the 8th book in a series. It overlaps a trilogy, and it's setting up, several comic series.
If you're taking the standalone outside of any X-Wing stuff before it, definitely not.
Yeah. I mean, I would say that you could start Rogue Squadron. Like, if you had never read anything, if you'd never read Thrawn Trilogy, you just seen the movies, you could start with Rogue Squadron. You could start with Wraith Squadron, I think.
Yeah.
Or you could start with Starfighters of Adamar. I think those are all things that you could read that you could start there.
I don't think you should start on Adamar alone for the payoffs.
But... No, you shouldn't, but you could. Like, it's a great standalone. Like, we can say that Adamar is a standalone. Whereas I don't think Isard's Revenge is a standalone because it is book 5 of the Isard series. It's book 8 of the X-Wing series. And it does pay off some of the Wraith Squadron stuff with Min and with the general stuff. And it is also the way that Stackpole was able to finish off his main plot in the X-Wing comics.
Yeah, I just remembered something I didn't think to put in the notes. Also, when you were talking about the Isard stuff and the Wraith stuff, try and get in the head of Isard reminded me of what the Wraiths were doing with
Zinj. Booster logic.
Yes, and I gotta imagine the Wraiths had also been assigned to do that by Kraken. He just was putting 2 separate teams together.
Yes.
Because as we know, wonder,
maybe Isard had other plans that the Wraiths foiled elsewhere,
Yeah.
Do you think that this is Stackpole's last official X-Wing book? Although I argue that the Dark Tide books are also X-Wing books. Do you think that Isard's Revenge feels like a finale?
Yeah. I mean, it sets things up pretty well with everybody, all the characters except Gavin and Isard.
Yeah, I think it's okay. To me, it feels more like Survivor's Quest, which is kind of an epilogue to the Hand of Thrawn. Nothing really major happens to the main characters because the book doesn't treat Gavin like a main character. It kind of exists to fill in gaps, and it's just kind of another adventure that ends pretty happily.
Yeah, if it weren't, and this is nothing against Anderson, but if it weren't for a Jedi Academy trilogy, I'd say it really sets up Wedge and Wraith well.
Yes, you could argue that. But I mean, Stackpole was deliberately trying to walk that line, which we'll talk about next month when we talk about Jedi, because that really dives into that. There's, I don't know. I don't see this as a finale. I definitely see it as wrapping things up, but it's more the continuing adventures than the grand finale. Because if you look at how Stackpole wrote Back to War, that's a finale. Destroying the Lusankya, killing Isard, even though she wasn't really dead. She was dead in that book. And the speech that Wedge gives at the end is very finale of a series speech. It's like, here's the themes. I love you all. These are my people. This one, it kind of ends with him flirting a bit with Ayala, and Ayala is sad because Isard goes off, and Isard should have been dead. But I don't know. I stand by my belief that this isn't really a finale book. It's another adventure.
Yeah, I will mention that New Jedi Order books. I forget which ones do set up later relationship endings with other people for Gavin and Narin.
Yes, thankfully. So what would you say Isard's Revenge is about? What are some themes or messages that you think it has?
Didn't really think to look for that when I was reading. I mean, it's sort of, digging deeper into why they're fighting in a way that can't just be, the Empire's bad guys, we're the good guys.
Dealing with being the dominant superpower and what is a moral way to confront actual evil. Because, Krenel, it talks about how he purges thousands of people. Like, he is actively murdering his subjects. But he's not aggressively expanding. There's a hint that he's about to be able to build Star Destroyers, but he's not doing it now. He only has 12 worlds. Only one of them is really a rich world.
And his super weapon is a fake.
And it's not
he didn't even know about. Yeah.
Yes. So it's very much dealing with that, Kosovo, Yugoslavia, Baltic states, and even some Rwanda type violence, interstate violence, and what can a superpower that isn't directly affected by these events, what can it do about it? What should it do about it?
Right. So that's what I was thinking for when, the good guys, bad guys thing. It's not like he's an existential threat anymore, like they faced with Thrawn or.
And I very much side with Min. As I kind of explained when we were talking about Min, I think the moral obligation that the New Republic has to liberate Taprawa and other worlds that helped the New Republic, and it just lets them rot under Imperial brutal tyranny. I think that bothers me. And I think that Stackpole means it to bother. I mean, the fact that he gives a lot of attention to Borskvalia just maneuvering in this selfish and nasty way shows that he doesn't think the New Republic is a perfect state. I do think he thinks it's a good state, a state that we should root for, but definitely full of people who make it complicated. And I think that the sympathetic Imperials, like the commander at Linane 3 and Broke Vessery, are meant to make us think that the enemy is also complicated.
Yeah, Vessery's would have been interesting to see him like in the Vaughn War.
Yes. Yes.
That's like, yeah, there's... Yeah, he never shows up again either.
Yeah.
Not
I would say
officially.
that there's not a ton of thematic stuff, especially not when you compare it to like the mental health stuff in the Wraith books, or of course the themes that we're going to get in iJedi and Starfighters of Adumar, which I think are some of the most thematically rich books in all of Star Wars.
Yeah.
Now, let's wrap up our literary discussion with a nerd's favorite thing. Where would we put this? Now, we're not going to do a whole re-ranking thing, but between which books would you put Isard's Revenge? Unless you're crazy and put it at the top, or you really hate it and put it at the bottom.
I don't hate it, but I got to put something at the bottom, and it might end up down there.
I mean, I still think Kratos' Trap is at the bottom for me.
Yeah, it's either last or second last with Kratos' Trap.
I honestly think it's going to be between Kratos' Trap and Wedge's Gamble. So it's going to be, 7th of 8th. So we're kind of the same, but that's not to say we dislike it. Both of us love the droid part. We like the Min part. We like a lot of the stuff in it. I just think it doesn't quite come together as a really great book.
Yeah, and if we're ranking X-Wing, something's got to go.
And the thing about X-Wing is the highs of the X-Wing series are really high.
To quote Cal Tainer, or to paraphrase Cal Tainer, it may be the worst of the X-Wing series, but it's still the X-Wing series, as he said to Tyria when she was lowest ranked in a Wedge and Wraith squadron.
There are literally 100 Star Wars books that I would put below Isard's Revenge. All right, now we're on our wing books section. So what books or other story would we recommend to people who liked this month's book? So my wing book is going to be The Protector of the Small Quartet by Tamara Pierce. This is a 1990s young adult feminist fantasy series about a young girl who grows from, I want to say 10 to I think 18 or 19. And she becomes a squire and then a page and then a knight in this fantasy kingdom that mostly only let boys be knights. So she's the second girl to become a knight. And it really talks about the structure and logistics and class of the society that it makes up. And I appreciate the complexity that Pierce brings to her antagonists and villains in the book, similar to how Stackpole brings complexity to his Imperials in this book. And Stackpole also in his talking about the ranks, the promotions, talks a lot about leadership and what it takes and the loyalty of the men. And I think that's also a big theme in Protector of the Small. So that's what I would recommend, Protector of the Small by Tamara Pierce as my wing book.
Yeah. So mine, and I mentioned this series before, but I'm going to delve back into that well of the Skyward novels by Brandon Sanderson. Mainly, this one was, I can't remember if it was fully written or co-written.
So it's technically co-written, but all the words were written by the co-author. So it's co-plotted, but written by, what's her name, Jancy Quinn or something?
Jancy Patterson.
Yeah, Jancy Patterson.
So this is an anthology of 3 novellas called Skyward Flight. So you've got the multiple points of view between them, spoilery stuff that makes them similar that I won't fully spell out. But then there's also political wrangling and some enemy espionage stuff, and that make them really similar. And the main starfighter in these books has something like the tractor beam of the TIE Defender, so that helped align it with Isard's Revenge in particular.
Oh, and don't forget, there's lots of promotions too.
That too, yes.
Yeah, I enjoyed the Skyward Flight. That might be a little long for what you got out of it, but it was very fun and fleshed out the world a lot. Next time, we will be reading our first non-official X-Wing book, and this is I, Jedi, also by Michael Stackpole. So 2 Stackpole books in a row, very fun. We will talk about why we're reading this in an X-Wing podcast, why we're not reading Courtship of Princess Leia in an X-Wing podcast, but we are reading this. And why is Egg Jedi one of the most beloved Star Wars books that was ever released in the 90s?
And how did it have retroactive foreshadowing in Isard's Revenge?
Yes, we'll
In
talk
a way
a lot
I
about
can't
that.
tell you until you've read it. You being the listener.
So, join us next time for iJedi. And in the meantime, keep your books locked in reading position.